The heat that day was a heavy, living thing. It pressed down on the flat, brown land and made the air above the railroad tracks shimmer like a wobbly mirage. A girl sat on a small, battered suitcase by the gravel-side road, the sharp stones digging into her legs. She was 17, but felt much younger right then. The dust from the car that had just left her, that was still hanging in the air. A brown cloud slowly settling back to earth. She watched that cloud until it disappeared, as if hoping the car would magically reappear within it. It didn't. The only thing that came was a deep, ringing silence. It was louder than the engine's roar had been. Out here, there were no city sounds, no people talking, not even many birds. Just the sigh of a hot wind through the dry grass and the buzzing of invisible insects. Her name was Alara. A name her mother had chosen from a book. A name that felt silly and out of place here in all this emptiness. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the thick lump in her throat. Her father's words played on a loop in her head. His voice had been flat, tired. "This life," he'd said, staring straight ahead at the dirt road, "this life is no place for a girl. Your aunt in the city, she'll set you straight. The train will come. You wait for it." He had handed her the suitcase, the one with the broken clasp she'd fixed with a piece of string. It held everything she owned: 2 changes of clothes, a hairbrush, a faded photograph of her mother, who was long gone, and a small wooden horse her grandfather had carved for her when she was small. That was it. That was her whole life in that scuffed-up case. The car door had slammed, a final, terrible sound. He hadn't looked back. Not once. She'd stood there frozen as the car bounced down the rutted track, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a speck, and then it was gone where the land met the sky. That's when her legs gave out. She didn't mean to crumple. It was as if the bones had just vanished. She sank onto the gravel, the sharp edges biting through her thin dress. The first tear that fell made a dark little star in the dust. Then another. Then she couldn't stop them. It wasn't pretty crying. It was ugly, choking sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for the father who left her. She cried for the mother she missed every single day. She cried because she was scared, more scared than she'd ever been in her life. What if the train didn't come? What if her aunt didn't want her? What was in this vast, empty land that could hurt a girl all alone? Her tears mixed with the dust on her face, making muddy tracks. She hugged her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible, wishing she could just disappear into the ground. The sun beat down on the back of her neck. An hour, he'd said. The train was an hour away. It felt like a lifetime. It felt like a sentence. She looked down the endless, straight line of the railroad tracks. They seemed to go on forever in both directions, a steel path to nowhere. The emptiness was a physical weight on her chest. This wasn't like being alone in her room. This was different. This was being a tiny, trembling thing in a world too big and too quiet. Every rustle in the grass made her heart jump. Was it a snake? Was it someone coming? But no one came. The world was utterly still. The only proof that other people existed was those 2 thin lines of steel. She wiped her nose on the sleeve of her dress, feeling a wave of shame. She was too old to be crying like this. She was supposed to be strong. But out here, all the strength had leaked out of her, soaked into the dry, uncaring earth. Time stretched and blurred in the heat. It might have been 10 minutes or 40. Her crying eventually slowed, fading into hiccups and a dull, aching emptiness inside. She was just staring blankly at a bent piece of railroad tie, her mind numb. When she felt it dot, it wasn't a sound first. It was a change in the light. The brilliant sun on her shoulders was suddenly blocked. A long, dark shadow fell across her, covering her and her little suitcase. The shadow was shaped like a man and a horse. Her breath hitched. Fear, sharp and cold, shot through the haze of her misery. Slowly, very slowly, she raised her head, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun now behind the figure. A man sat on a tall, quiet horse. The horse was a dusty color, like the land itself, and it stood perfectly still. The man was tall, even in the saddle. He wore a hat that shadowed his face, but she could see the set of his jaw, clean and firm. His clothes were worn and faded, the color of earth and hard work. He didn't speak. He didn't smile or frown. He just looked. His gaze moved from her tear-stained, dirty face down to the pathetic suitcase, and then followed the road to the empty horizon where her old life had vanished. Elara couldn't move. She was pinned by his look, by the sheer, silent reality of him. He was the first living thing she'd seen since the car left. Who was he? What did he want? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. The man shifted slightly in the saddle. The leather creaked, a soft, familiar sound. Still silent, he leaned down from his horse. He was close enough now that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the dust on his worn leather gloves. He didn't reach for her suitcase. He didn't offer a hand to help her stand. Instead, he simply held out his gloved hand, palm up, toward her. It was an offer, a question. It hung in the hot air between them. The choice, for the first time that awful day, was hers. The man's hand stayed where it was, suspended in the hot, still air between them. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was just there, a simple weathered leather glove pointing slightly upward, waiting. Elara stared at it, her mind a blank page of fear. The tears on her cheeks had dried into tight, itchy tracks. All she could hear was the blood pounding in her own ears and the soft, snuffling breath of the big horse. Who was he? Why didn't he say anything? Her eyes darted from his hand to his face, still hidden in the shadow of his hat brim. She looked past him, down the empty road, then back at the cold, impersonal railroad tracks. The train was supposed to be her future, a noisy, clanging thing that would carry her to a maybe aunt and a maybe life. This man on the horse was silence. He was the opposite of the train, a part of her, the part that was still shaking from being left behind, screamed at her to stay put, to curl up tighter and wait for the metal monster on the tracks. That was the plan. That was what she was told to do. But another part, a smaller, quieter part that had been watching the empty horizon with a sinking heart, looked at that outstretched hand and saw something else. It wasn't a command. It was a choice. He wasn't pulling her up. He was offering a way up. He had seen her at her absolute worst, covered in dust and despair, and he hadn't turned his horse away. He had stopped. Her own hand, resting on her knee, was small and bare and dirty. She uncurled her fingers, which were stiff from clenching. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she lifted her arm. Her heart was beating so hard, it felt like it might crack a rib. Her fingertips, trembling, touched the rough leather of his glove. The moment she made contact, his fingers closed around her hand. His grip wasn't gentle, but it wasn't harsh either. It was solid, absolutely solid, like gripping a well-rooted fence post in a storm. It was the first real steady thing she had touched all day. In one smooth motion. He pulled. It was so effortless it took her breath away. Her feet left the ground. The gravel fell away beneath her, and suddenly she was up, swinging through the air. For a second, she was afraid she would land wrong, or scare the horse, or just tumble right back down. But the motion was sure and practiced. She found herself settled not in the saddle in front of him, but perched behind it, on a rolled-up blanket tied to the horse's back. It was a humble seat, but it felt secure. Before she could even think to grab hold of anything, The man reached back, still without turning his head or speaking, and guided one of her hands to a leather strap hanging from the saddle. She wrapped her fingers around it, holding on for dear life. Her other arm instinctively went out to balance herself, brushing against the back of his wool shirt. He felt real. Warm Dot, he made a small sound in his throat, a soft click that was almost lost in the wind. The horse, which had stood like a statue, immediately came to life. It turned its great head away from the railroad tracks, its hooves crunching on the gravel as it pivoted. They were now facing the wide open land, a sea of golden grass and low, rolling hills she hadn't even noticed before. The tracks were beside them, soon to be behind them. The horse stepped forward, and the world began to move. The motion was a steady, rocking rhythm, so different from the jarring bounce of the car that had left her. The wind, which had been a dead weight of heat before, now flowed past her face, cooling her skin. She was up high. She could see for miles. The vastness that had felt so terrifying from the ground felt different from up here. It was still huge, but it wasn't empty anymore. She saw the patterns in the grass, the distant, dark line of trees following a hidden creek. A hawk circling high on a thermal, she held onto the strap, her knuckles white, her body tense, trying to match the rhythm of the horse. She was terrified of falling off. She kept waiting for the man to say something. Anything. Hold on tight, or it's a long ride, or even what's your name? But he didn't. He just rode. His back was straight, his shoulders relaxed. He occasionally shifted his weight slightly, guiding the horse with pressures so small she couldn't see them. The silence stretched. It wasn't the scary, lonely silence from before. This was a different kind. It was a silence full of sounds. The steady clop-clop of hooves on hard-packed earth, the creak of leather, the sigh of the wind, the horse's deep breathing. It was a silence she had to step into. Her own frantic thoughts began to slow down, like muddy water settling. The raw panic started to recede, leaving behind a deep, weary ache and a buzzing curiosity. Who was this man? Where was he taking her? Was this dangerous? She studied his back, the patches on his shirt, the way his hair curled against his sun-browned neck below his hat. He didn't seem like a man who would hurt her. He felt careful, deliberate. He had lifted her onto the horse like she was something fragile, not like a sack of grain. Dot, as the sun began its slow slide toward the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a strange feeling came over her. For the first time since the car drove away, she wasn't waiting. She wasn't stuck. She was going somewhere. She didn't know where, but she was moving. And for now, in the quiet company of this silent man and his steady horse, that was enough. The tight knot in her chest loosened, just a little. She took a deep breath, the first full one in hours, and held on. The horse moved with a steady, eating up the miles kind of walk. The railroad tracks had long since vanished behind a fold in the land, replaced by a rolling ocean of grass that seemed to go on forever. Elara held on to the leather strap, her body slowly learning the rhythm of the animal's gait. She was tired, a deep tiredness that went right down to her bones, but the fear of falling off kept her awake, that the man in front of her never turned around. He just rode. He'd point with a slight tilt of his chin, or shift his weight, and the horse would adjust its path, angling toward a line of dark trees in the distance that slowly grew larger. As they got closer, she heard it, the faint, friendly sound of running water. The trees marked a creek, its banks green and lush compared to the dry plains. Dot, the horse plodded down a gentle bank and stopped at the water's edge. The man finally moved, swinging a leg over and dropping to the ground with a soft thud. He kept a hand on the reins, his movements calm and easy. Only then did he look up at her. He didn't smile, but his eyes, now that she could see them in the shade of the trees, were a quiet, watchful blue. He nodded toward the creek, then looped the reins over a low-branched dot. It took her a moment to understand. He was giving her a moment to herself. She carefully slid off the horse, her legs wobbly and strange after the long ride. She stumbled a little when her feet hit the ground, the feeling rushing back into them in a painful tingle. She steadied herself against the horse's warm, dusty side, and the animal didn't even flinch. She walked stiffly to the creek's edge and knelt on the soft, cool earth. The water was clear and fast-moving over smooth stones. She cupped her hands and drank. It was the coldest, sweetest water she had ever tasted. She drank until her stomach felt full and cold, then splashed some on her face, scrubbing at the dried tears and dust. The shock of the cold water on her skin felt like waking up from a bad dream. When she turned back, the man had opened a saddlebag. He pulled out a cloth wrapped around something, and a dented metal canteen. He walked over, handed her the canteen, a gesture to fill it, and then placed the cloth bundle on a flat rock nearby. He walked back to his horse, giving her space again. She filled the canteen, the water bubbling and gurgling. When she returned, she saw he had opened the cloth. Inside were 2 thick pieces of cornbread, plain and a little dry, and a chunk of hard yellow cheese. He was already eating his share, sitting on a log a few feet away, looking out at the creek. He motioned with his head for her to take the other piece. She sat on the rock, the food in her lap. She was suddenly so hungry her hands shook. She broke off a piece of the cornbread and ate it. It was simple, a little crumbly, but it tasted like safety, like someone had thought ahead. She ate slowly, watching him from the corner of her eye. He ate with the same quiet focus he did everything else. When he finished, he took a long drink from his own canteen, then pulled out a small, sharp knife and a piece of wood from his pocket. He began to whittle, the soft shush-shush sound joining the babble of the creek dot. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was just there, like the trees and the water. She found her voice, though it came out as a rusty croak. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling too loud in the quiet. He didn't stop whittling. He just gave a single slow nod, his eyes on the curl of wood, peeling away from his knife. "My name's Elara," she offered, needing to put something of herself into this strange quiet. He glanced up at her, held her gaze for a second, and nodded again. But he didn't offer his name back. He just went back to his whittling. She wasn't offended. It felt like, for him, names weren't the important thing right now. The important thing was the food, the water, the rest. When the last crumbs were gone, he stood up. He brushed the wood shavings from his pants, put his knife and the unfinished carving away, and walked to his horse. He checked the animal's legs, ran a hand down its neck, then looked at her. It was time to go. He didn't lift her up this time. Instead, he led the horse to a large, mossy stump by the bank. He pointed to it. Understanding, she climbed onto the stump. From there, it was easier to get her foot into the stirrup and pull herself up onto the blanket roll behind the saddle. He watched, making sure she was settled, before swinging up in front of her. They rode for hours more as the afternoon light turned golden. The land changed, rising into pine-covered hills. The air grew cooler and smelled of resin and damp earth, just as the sun began to dip behind the tallest peaks. They came around a bend in a trail she hadn't even known was a trail, and she saw it. A small log cabin sat in a clearing, smoke curling from a stone chimney. A weathered barn leaned comfortably beside it, and a rough wooden fence corralled a few more horses, who lifted their heads and whinnied a greeting. A chicken scratched in the dirt near the cabin's front step. It wasn't much. It was simple and worn, but it looked solid. It looked like a place that had stood against a lot of winters. The man rode right up to the barn door, slid off, and began to unsaddle his horse with quick, efficient movements. The door of the cabin opened, and an older man stepped out. He was as thin and wiry as the first man was tall and solid, with a face like a wrinkled apple and a bushy gray mustache. He wiped his hands on a cloth and squinted at them. "Well now," the older man said, his voice a friendly rasp. "Walter, didn't expect you back with company." He looked at Elara, his eyes kind but curious dot, so his name was Walter. Elara looked at the tall man Walter, who just gave his horse a pat and carried the saddle into the barn. He hadn't said a word to her for the entire journey, but he had brought her here, to a place with a chimney smoking and a man who knew his name. The older man walked over, looking up at her still on the horse. "Climb on down, child," he said, his tone gentle. "You look rode hard and put away wet. Name's Henry. I do the cooking around here, such as it is. You hungry?" At his words, the simple, profound reality of it all hit her. She was off the tracks. She was no longer waiting. She was here, wherever here was. She managed to get down, her legs aching. She looked toward the barn where Walter had disappeared, then back at the cook named Henry, who was waiting for an answer. She nodded. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "I'm hungry." The cabin was one room, warm and full of shadows from the fire in the big stone fireplace. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something savory simmering in a pot. Henry, the cook, moved around like he owned the place, which in a way he did. He didn't ask her any big questions, not at first. He just pointed to a wash basin and a rough towel on a bench by the door. "Clean up if you like," he said. "Supper's near ready." Elara washed her hands and face, the water turning gray with the dust from the road. It felt good. When she turned, a tin plate was already waiting for her on a small, scarred table. It held a big scoop of stew, with chunks of potato and carrot and meat she didn't recognize, and another piece of the same dry cornbread. Walter came in from the barn, the cool evening air following him. He sat on a stool by the fire, his own plate in his large hands. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the clink of spoons on tin dot. It was Henry who finally broke the quiet, but not in a prying way. He was washing the plates in a bucket. "Walter here finds things," he said, as if telling her the weather. "Lost calves, broken fence lines. Sometimes," he said, glancing at her, "other things that don't belong by the railroad tracks." Walter didn't look up. He just took a sip of his coffee. "Got a cot in the corner there," Henry continued, nodding to a narrow bed piled with wool blankets. "You can use it. We're up before the sun. You pull your weight, you can stay. You don't, you won't." He said it plainly, without meanness. It was just the rule of the place. That was her first day. The next morning, a hand gently shook her cot frame before the sky had even begun to lighten. It was Walter. He pointed to a stack of folded clothes on a chair, a worn flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that were too big, with a piece of rope for a belt. Then he pointed outside, toward the barn. That was how she learned. Not with speeches, but with points and gestures and quiet examples. Her life became a series of small, clear tasks. She learned to carry water from the pump, her arms aching with the heavy buckets. Henry showed her how to peel potatoes and scrub the big black cooking pot without wasting a speck of soap. Walter taught her, without words, how to pour grain into the horses' troughs without startling them, and how to brush an animal's coat in long, smooth strokes. The horses, at first, seemed huge and frightening, but Walter would stand beside her, his calmness seeping into the animals, and soon she learned they were just big, gentle creatures who liked the feeling of the brush. Days turned into weeks. The sharp, panicked grief of being left behind didn't go away, but it got quieter, buried under layers of good, hard work. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused. Her face grew brown from the sun. She stopped jumping at every sound. The silence of the men, which had been so strange at first, became normal. She realized Walter's silence wasn't empty. It was full of noticing. He noticed when a horse had a stone in its hoof before it went lame. He noticed when a fence post was just starting to rot. And she saw that he noticed things about her too. He'd leave a sharper knife for her to use on the vegetables. He'd silently take the heaviest bucket from her when her arms were trembling and carry it the last few steps himself. One evening, she was trying to mend a tear in the old shirt she wore, her stitches clumsy and big. Walter was whittling by the fire, as he often did. He watched her struggle for a while, her face scrunched up in frustration. Then he put his own work down. He walked over, took the needle and thread from her hands, and in a few quick, sure movements, showed her a smaller, stronger stitch. He handed it back. He didn't smile, but his eyes were patient. She tried again, her stitches improving just a little. He gave a single nod. It felt like winning a prize. Henry was the one who filled the quiet with stories. He talked about the land, about winters so deep the snow reached the roof, about spring calves being born in the muddy pasture. He never asked about her past. He just talked, and in doing so, he made a space for her in the present. He called her kid or young'un, and the way he said made her feel like she belonged. One afternoon, Walter motioned for her to follow him. He led her to a small, sunny patch behind the barn, near a pile of seasoned wood. He handed her an axe. It was heavier than anything she'd ever held. He stood a piece of wood on a thick stump, then stepped back. He looked at her, then at the wood. Her heart hammered. She lifted the axe, her arms wobbling. She brought it down, but it hit the side of the log and bounced off, barely making a mark. She tried again and again. Her palms grew sore. She was about to cry from frustration when Walter stepped close. He didn't take the axe. Instead, he put his hands over hers on the handle, adjusting her grip. He moved her feet, positioning her body. He showed her, with the pressure of his own hands, the motion not just from the arms, but from the whole body, a smooth, swinging arc. He stepped back. She took a breath, feeling the new stance in her bones. She swung. The axe blade bit deep into the wood with a solid, satisfying thunk. It didn't split it, but it was in there. It was a start. She looked at him, a surprised smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like forever. He didn't smile back, but the corner of his eye crinkled just for a second. He gave his single, slow nod and walked back toward the barn, leaving her there with the axe, the log, and a new strange feeling growing in her chest. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was the feeling of being capable, of being more than just the girl who was left crying. She was someone who could, with time, learn to split her own wood. The morning the letter came, the air had a new, crisp feel to it. Summer was softening at the edges, and the aspen leaves behind the cabin were starting to think about turning gold. Henry had gone to the small town, a half-day's ride away, for supplies they couldn't make or grow themselves. He came back with flour, salt, a few precious oranges, and a single wrinkled envelope. He held it out to her across the table. Postmaster said this was for you. Came general delivery, care of the ranch here. He looked both puzzled and a little worried. Didn't know you was expecting mail, kid. Elara's heart gave a funny little jump. No one knew she was here. She took the envelope with damp fingers. The handwriting was a woman's, looping and unfamiliar. The return address was in a city, hundreds of miles to the west. Her aunt. It had to be. She carried the letter outside, her breakfast forgotten. She sat on the stump by the woodpile, the place where she had learned to swing an axe. The sun was warm on her back, but her fingers were cold as she tore the envelope open. The letter was short. Her aunt wrote that she'd finally heard from Alara's father, who had sent a vague note saying the girl might be coming through. The aunt was concerned. She said there was always a room for family. She had enclosed a one-way bus ticket, leaving from the town in 3 days' time. "It's a proper life here," the letter said. "There are schools and opportunities for a young woman. Let me know you're safe and come as soon as you can." The bus ticket was a small, stiff rectangle of possibility. It felt heavy in her hand. A proper life. Schools, family. It was everything she was supposed to want. Everything her father had sent her toward. She sat there for a long time, the paper trembling slightly. She looked at the cabin, the smoke curling from the chimney. She looked at the barn where Walter was, probably mending harnesses. She looked at the horses in the pasture, their coats glossy in the morning light. She looked at the mountains, solid and unchanging against the sky. This wasn't a proper life by most people's standards. It was hard and quiet and dirty. It was calluses and sore muscles and silence. But it was also the taste of cold creek water, the solid thunk of an axe biting through, the warmth of the fire after a long, cold day of work. It was Henry's stories and Walter's quiet nods. It was the feeling of being seen not as a problem, but as a person who could learn, who could pull her weight. Walter came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw her sitting on the stump, the letter in her lap, the bus ticket pinched between her fingers. He stopped walking. He didn't come closer. He just stood there, waiting, his face its usual calm mask. But she had learned to read his eyes. She saw the question in them. She stood up, the letter crinkling. She walked toward him, her feet knowing the path in the dirt. She held out the ticket, like she was showing him a strange insect she'd found. "It's from my aunt," she said, her voice sounding small. "In the city. She sent a bus ticket. She says I should come." Walter looked at the ticket, then at her face. He took the rag and slowly wiped a smudge of grease from his thumb. He was thinking, his gaze moving from her to the distant horizon, just as it had on that first day by the tracks. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough from lack of use, but the words were clear. They were more words than she'd ever heard him say at once. "Train runs both ways," he said slowly, his eyes locked on hers. "Bus does too." He paused, letting the meaning settle. "Your choice." Then he turned and walked back into the barn, leaving her alone in the yard with the letter, the ticket, and those 3 simple, enormous words. Your choice. All those weeks ago, she had had no choice. She had been left. She had been picked up. She had been brought here. But now, he was giving it back to her. The power to decide her own life. She thought of the city aunt, a kind voice on a page, a stranger offering a stranger's version of safety. She thought of the bus, another metal thing to carry her away from the silence and the peace she had found. Then she looked at the woodpile, at the axe stuck in a stump. She looked at the water pump she had painted just last week under Henry's direction. She looked at the cabin door, always unlocked. She thought of the silent man in the barn who had taught her how to be strong without ever telling her she was weak. Her choice. A strange calm washed over her, quieting the buzzing confusion in her head. It was so simple, really. She walked over to the fence post where the ranch's old mailbox was nailed, a tin can painted red. She lifted the stiff little bus ticket. She didn't crumple it or tear it dramatically. She just bent it once, then again, until it was a small, thick square. She pushed it deep into the mailbox, down into the darkness where spiders made their webs. It was not a grand gesture for anyone to see. It was just a thing put away. Then she turned and walked toward the barn. Her steps weren't hesitant. They were sure, the steps of someone who knows where she's going. Walter was oiling a saddle, the rich smell of leather and linseed oil filling the air. He didn't look up as she entered, but she knew he was aware of her. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Words had never been the currency of this place. She walked over to the wall where the brushes hung, took down the one with the stiff bristles for the horses' coats, and walked past him to where his big buckskin horse stood in its stall. She began to brush its side in the long, smooth strokes he had taught her. The horse shifted its weight. Content dot from the corner of her eye, she saw Walter stop his work. He watched her for a long moment, her arm moving in the familiar rhythm, her face calm and focused on the task. He gave a slow, deep nod, not to her, but to himself. A nod of acceptance. A nod of something like peace. Then he went back to oiling T**.